Hello everyone. 3 years ago today, if this video gets released on time, it won't, Russia escalated an ongoing imperialist struggle by invading the country of Ukraine. Since then, we have seen countless atrocities: massacres, deportation, ethnic cleansing, torture, attacks on civilian centers, and more, committed primarily by Russia. Throughout these 3 years, we've seen both sides throw around countless accusations, some true, some false. It's like everyone has chosen who they support and is trying to convince everyone that they're right and that their opponents are demons who want to destroy all that is good in the world. I'm not going to do that today. I'm not going to dwell on the morality of the situation. I'm not going to debate who is better in this war. I want to do an objective analysis of the situation. Importantly, because I want to show that this war is an inter-imperialist war fought on one side by NATO and the whole Western Bloc, and on the other by Russia. First, how did this all happen? When the USSR was dissolved in 1991, it created one very important question for everyone: what now? In this, there were 3 players with 3 separate answers: the West, Russia, and the newly independent Eastern European states. The future of Eastern Europe, in the eyes of the West, could only be one of NATO-EU hegemony.
Repeated with Lebed, they talked about they don't want this NATO expansion, they know it's not in their security interests, and on, and said, well, and if you do that, we may have to look to China. And I couldn't help using the colloquial expression from my state by saying to Zhganov, lots of luck in your senior year. I knew, they knew, everybody knows that that is not an option. And everybody knows, every one of those leaders acknowledges and needs, and they resent it. But they need to look west.
At least that was the conclusion that Western leaders, most importantly those of the US, had come to by the mid-90s. Russia was to be treated not as a threat, but not exactly as an ally. To the West, Russia was eternally a potential rival, and thus every measure was to be taken to make sure that it could never harm Western imperial hegemony. For this, a 2-pronged strategy was adopted. 1, the West would try to cooperate with Russia to ensure peace in their shared geopolitical region, and 2, the West would develop its military and economic capabilities to fight against Russia if the time came. For Russia, Eastern Europe would have to either be neutral or in the Russian sphere of influence. By 1994, Russia had abandoned any hopes of joining NATO. Therefore, they instead wanted to cooperate with the West to make sure that they would not interfere in their soft power domination of post-Soviet states through the organizations of the SIC and the CSTO. As for the Eastern European states, they were clear in the direction they themselves wanted to go. They wanted to be with the West. Why? There were 2 main reasons for the Eastern European movement towards the Western Bloc. One economic, one political. Economically, the EU represented the kind of stability that these states wanted to have. The post-Soviet years were very hard, and both the leadership and populations of Eastern European countries thought that joining the EU would at least help them in their recovery. On the other front, Eastern Europeans were scared of the kind of political domination they had experienced historically at the hands of Russia, including the Soviet Union, which these states considered a Russian imperial project. For them, no matter how many agreements were signed, no matter how far Russia went in its diplomatic posturing, Russia was always a potential threat. Knowing this, it becomes obvious that NATO and the EU would expand into Eastern Europe, inviting Visegrad Group members Poland, Hungary, and Czechia in 1997 during the Madrid summit of that year. And it becomes equally obvious that Russia would be totally opposed to this expansion, citing security concerns.
And I'm not persuaded by the assurances that we hear that Russia has nothing to worry about.
In fact, it was obvious to many when this decision was taken. The decision of NATO-EU to accept Eastern European states into its alliances was a declaration of war by Western imperialism against Russian imperialism.
Now we have to finish what America started 4 years ago, welcoming Hungary, Poland, and the Czech Republic into our alliance. If you look around at who's in the room today, you can see that they are more than willing to be a good partner. They will make NATO stronger. They will make Europe safer. And in so doing, they will make America and our young people more secure. They will make it less likely that the young men and women in uniform who serve under General Shelton and the other generals here and their successors in the 21st century will have to fight and die because of problems in Europe. A new NATO can extend the blessings of freedom and security in a new century. With the help of our allies, the support of the Senate, the strength of our continued commitment, we can bring Europe together, not by force of arms, but by possibilities of peace. That is the promise of this moment, and we must seize it. Thank you very much.
The first battle of that war was that of Visegrad, which was won decisively by the West in 1999 with the accession of Poland, Hungary, and Czechia into the alliance. The second battle was that of Vilnius, which was also won in 2004 with the accession of the Baltic states, Bulgaria, Romania, Slovenia, and Slovakia into NATO. This was a massive loss for Russia, as now NATO is quite literally on its doorstep. Additionally, the previously mentioned new NATO members were accepted into the EU as well in the same year. Romania and Bulgaria joined later in 2007. Then came the advancement into former Yugoslavia with the accession of Croatia and Albania to NATO in 2009, with the former joining the EU in 2013. In 2020, North Macedonia was the last Vilnius group member to join NATO. Russia only managed to secure a very small victory in Belarus, which has only moved closer to Russia under the presidency of longtime Putin ally and Europe's last dictator Alexander Lukashenko. After Russia's unsuccessful attempt to subjugate Georgia to its imperial interests through military force in 2008, the only remaining battleground was Ukraine.
Helping Ukraine move toward NATO membership is in the interest of every member in the alliance and will help advance security and freedom in this region and around the world.
Ukraine's foreign policy since independence was a balancing of Russian and Western influence. The country was torn between nationalists who wanted to affirm Ukraine's independence from Russia by joining the EU, and Russophiles who wanted to strengthen economic ties with Russia. This division was reflected in the nature of the presidency. Every new election seemed like a switch between a pro-Western or pro-Russian president, from the more or less neutral Kravchuk to the Russian-leaning Kuchma to pro-Western Yushchenko, and then the pro-Russian Yanukovych. The West and East did not just sit still while this happened. In fact, they stoked the conflict by supporting their respective factions. For example, the US provided diplomatic support to Yushchenko and anti-Kuchma protesters during the 2004 Orange Revolution, and even funded the Freedom House group in Kyiv, which gave support to protesters during the revolution, as well as multiple Ukrainian NGOs. Russia, in turn, also endorsed Yanukovych, who ran against Yushchenko in the 2004 Ukrainian election. Yanukovych also allegedly received $200 million in financial support from Russian oil companies. In 2010, Yanukovych soundly defeated Yulia Tymoshenko in the Ukrainian presidential election, becoming the new president of Ukraine. Initially, he presented himself as somewhat of a moderate figure. His stated aims were to unite the country and keep Ukraine neutral, while cooperating with both NATO, EU, and Russia, which showed in his policy-making. What is interesting about this policy is how much of a lack of a solution it was to the problem. This was a struggle for the control of an entire nation, and neither side was going to accept the halfway deal that Yanukovych was accepting. Eventually, he would be forced to pick between the West and the East. When that time came, he chose the East. In February 2013, the Verkhovna Rada, Ukraine's parliament, voted overwhelmingly to sign the EU-Ukraine Association Agreement. The finalization of the treaty was to be discussed on the 28th of November that same year. This agreement, if implemented, would mark a significant step towards Ukrainian integration and later accession into the EU. To Russia, however, it would mean defeat in the war against the West. Thus, the country did everything to prevent the implementation of the agreement. In August, Russia tightened customs rules for imports from Ukraine. The act essentially halted any exports, costing Ukrainian companies up to $2.5 billion. This was done to put pressure on the Ukrainian economy and force Ukraine to join the Russian-led Eurasian Customs Union. In September, the Kremlin warned Ukraine of economic collapse were it to sign the agreement. By October, the trade war had been expanded towards EU states like Lithuania. After months of what amounted to economic blackmail, Yanukovych succumbed to Kremlin pressure and withdrew from the agreement on the 21st of November. Later in December, he signed an action plan with Russia, where Russia would buy up Ukrainian Eurobonds and lower natural gas export prices. This deal was offered as a counter to the EU deal and Ukrainian desires for another IMF loan. Many Ukrainians who were already suffering from a recession, who were sick of their corrupt government, now saw their president turn away from a popular agreement towards what was in effect economic subjugation to Moscow. It was clear to the people, Yanukovych had to go. The next 3 months saw Ukraine engulfed in anti-government protests referred to as Euromaidan, ending with the 2014 Revolution of Dignity. Before we continue, we have to answer an important question. Who were the revolutionaries? The mainstream narrative is that the Maidan Revolution was a liberal democratic revolution against an authoritarian government, but this is only a half-truth at best. In reality, the Maidan revolutionaries were people from all across the political spectrum, many of whom were very anti-liberal democracy. The main face of Maidan was the Maidan People's Union, with its 4 leaders from 3 different parties: former Prime Minister Yulia Tymoshenko and Arseniy Yatsenyuk of the Batyivshchina party, Vitaly Klitschko of the Ukrainian Democratic Alliance for Reform, and Oleg Tyanibok of the Svoboda party. The first 3 were largely pro-European liberal nationalists. However, Tyanibok was different. He was, and still is, the leader of Svoboda, a neo-fascist anti-Semitic and Russophobic political party. Additionally, out of the 41 members of the Maidan People's Union, 5 were members of Svoboda, accounting for 12% of its makeup. Now, this may seem small, but 12% fascism in your political group is a lot of fascism to not just have or tolerate, but promote in your political group. Fascists did not only play a role in the political formation of Maidan, they also participated in actual confrontations with political opponents on the street. The thing about liberals is that they tend to seek peaceful, non-violent solutions to conflicts. Fascists, on the other hand, do no such thing. They are often extremely violent, completely incapable of any peaceful demonstration. As such, they were very useful as foot soldiers for the Maidan movement. Far-right participation did not stop the liberal West from supporting the Maidan Revolution. In fact, Senator John McCain shook hands with Tianabuk in December 2013. The US government also lent direct financial support to opposition groups before and during the revolution. Now, this is not to say that Maidan was a US-backed coup or anything, but it would be dishonest not to talk about the significant involvement of the West in this event. Russia, too, played its part in the revolution, demanding a violent crackdown of the protests as well as aiding the flight of Yanukovych from the country. Again, we see Ukrainian politics turn into a battleground between two imperialist powers. On the 22nd of February 2014, Yanukovych was deposed by the Rada, and presidential elections were to be held in May. 5 days later, a coalition government was formed between the liberal nationalists Batkivshina and Svoboda, made up of 18 ministers, 6 from Batkivshina, 3 from Svoboda, and 9 non-partisan. Again, 3 out of 18 is not that much, but I think having any fascists at all in your cabinet is worrying, to say the least. The unrest would not end here. Immediately after the deposition of Yanukovych, disapproval among pro-Russians was growing. These mainly Russian-speaking Ukrainians were convinced, or at the very least concerned, that the new nationalist government would begin taking away their rights as minorities and forcibly Ukrainianize them. These fears, in my opinion, were not totally unfounded, given anti-Russian fascist participation in the government, and the immediate move to repeal the 2012 language law that made Russian, as well as other minority languages, an official regional language in much of Ukraine. Thousands of pro-Russians went out and rioted against the new government. Their demands were for greater autonomy of the Russophone minority, with some even calling for secession of whole regions. Eventually, this resulted in the invasion of Crimea by Russia, and the creation of the Donetsk, Luhansk, and Kharkov People's Republics in April of 2014. The Kharkov People's Republic was put down by Ukrainian authorities on the day of its declaration. However, the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics resisted attempts at dissolution, escalating the riots into a full-blown insurgency backed of course by Russia. This insurgency is now referred to as the Donbass War. Of course, if Russia was supporting the Donbass separatists, the West had to support the Ukrainian government, providing billions in dollars and euros in both military and financial aid. The post-Maidan government pushed Ukraine further into the camp of the West. It ratified the EU-Ukraine Association Agreement, bringing Ukraine and the EU closer together. It also signed a DCFTA agreement with the EU in 2016, as well as taking more loans from the IMF. In 2021, NATO affirmed again its commitment to the accession of Ukraine into its alliance. Unsurprisingly, Russia was unhappy with this turn of events. Since Ukraine had severed much of its economic ties with Russia, it was unable to use soft power imperialism to keep Ukraine within its control. A different strategy, therefore, was adopted. In early 2021, Russia, along with its ally Belarus, began a military buildup along the Ukrainian border. President Putin the same year denied the historical basis of the Ukrainian nation, claiming it was a Bolshevik creation. Russia's final attempt at a peaceful resolution of the inter-imperialist conflict was the demand for NATO withdrawal out of Eastern Europe, and a ban on Ukraine from entering the alliance. Their requests were denied. On the 22nd of February 2022, the Russian Federation Council authorized the use of the Russian military on foreign territory. 2 days later, Putin announced the beginning of a special military operation to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine. Since then, for 3 years, both the Russian and Ukrainian governments, the latter backed by the West, have killed thousands of working-class people for the sake of imperialist interests. Throughout this video, I have presented Ukraine as somewhat of a victim of Western and Russian aggression, which is true. However, I don't want to pretend as if the Ukrainian government is somehow innocent in this conflict. For the sake of maintaining its own power, the comprador bourgeois Ukrainian bureaucracy has completely subordinated itself to Western capital. It has become dependent on NATO and the EU on matters economic and political. If Ukraine were to somehow win the war against Russia, it would come out of it a puppet of the West. In order to trick the proletariat into supporting a war that is completely against their interests, they have used the age-old trick of patriotism and even fascism. During the insurgency, the Ukrainian government made use of far-right and neo-Nazi affiliated paramilitary groups in the fight against the separatists. The most famous of these groups is the Azov Battalion, now the Azov Brigade, under the command of the fascist Andrei Belitsky. The battalion made very liberal use of Nazi imagery, including the Wolfsengel and Black Sun. In recent times, the group has attempted to hide its far-right origins through skillful rebranding, but it is obvious the kind of people this group is made up of, even if they aren't screaming it in your face anymore. Additionally, historical figures like Bandera and his Nazi collaborationist OUNB were rehabilitated during the war. In 2014, only 31% of Ukrainians saw Bandera as a positive figure, compared to 48% viewing him negatively. In 2023, around 50% of Ukrainians viewed him positively, compared to 11% negatively. This is not to say that Russia's claims of Nazi control of Ukraine are valid, but it shows that the Ukrainian government, like every bourgeois government, is not averse to using fascism to maintain its power. Although the role of fascist parties in the Ukrainian government has declined, nationalism is still very much a part of its policy. In 2017, Ukrainian was made the required language of study in state schools. In 2019, a new language law was passed establishing the Ukrainian language as the official state language as well as compulsory fluency in Ukrainian for certain individuals, making it illegal to require fluency in any other language than Ukrainian and allowing the publication of print media in non-Ukrainian languages provided a Ukrainian counterpart is provided, not applied to Crimean Tatar. During the war, Ukraine has banned the import of books from Russia, Belarus, and Russian-occupied Ukraine, as well as putting further restrictions on Russian language publications and music. In complete violation of its so-called democratic principles, Ukraine has also cracked down on political freedom, banning 11 political parties for suspected links to Russia. It has also expanded government control over the media for the sake of censoring anti-government journalists. With Russia, I don't think I'll have to say much, but it too is guilty of using chauvinism to further its bourgeois political goals. It has moved to annex the occupied regions of Ukraine and is in the process of ethnically cleansing that part of the country and replacing its population with Russian settlers. It is conscripting its people en masse to fight a predatory war against their class siblings, all for the sake of capitalist profits. The war in Ukraine is a completely bourgeois and imperialist war, part of a bigger inter-imperialist war that is being waged all over the globe. It must be opposed by socialists all over the world. The only way to end it is the overthrow of both the Russian and Ukrainian capitalist governments by their working classes and the establishment of an anti-imperialist proletarian government. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. If you did not enjoy this video, you can leave a well-thought comment telling me why, or call me a bad word. If you have any questions or any videos you'd like me to make, you can put that in the comments too. Bye-bye.